Welcome to the Determinetruth podcast.
Want the truth? You can't handle the truth.
Where we aim to explore questions of truth, the scriptures, and what it means for the church today. Here are your hosts, Rob Dalrymple and Vinnie Angelo.
Hey everyone, welcome in. We are in episode 2 of 2 Corinthians. Last week we kicked it off. We didn't really get too much into the text, but we had a really good conversation on the church. that was fun. But today we're actually going to start going through some ideas in the text, right, Rob?
Yeah.
Cool. So let's do a quick reminder, and this will be a springboard into the text itself. But 2 Corinthians, really unique kind of letter. Paul has like church letters, and then he has these pastoral epistles that he writes to people. So of the church letters, I don't know, this feels, always like a stepchild.
Yeah, the
letter
ugly
to me.
stepsister. Totally.
I felt bad saying that, but it's like,
it's funny because I've studied obviously the entire New Testament, and I've studied most of the New Testament in quite a lot of depth. And a couple of years ago, I had a pastor say, "Hey, Rob, we want you to do a series on the book on 2 Corinthians." And I thought, that's literally, this is the one book that I haven't done the deepest dive on. And I'm thinking, I could do a sermon series for you, but that means I have to do a deep dive on 2 Corinthians. I guess I might as well put it out of the and get it done. This is definitely the ugly stepsister of the New Testament.
well, even you look at commentaries and whatnot, this seems to be like the least amount of resources out there. Mm-hmm. From a popular standpoint, there's passages from every book of the Bible that people seem to go to, that every book has some passage that is some sort of stencil on a wall in someone's house or a license plate frame. But for 2 Corinthians, this seems to be the one that, what are the things that stand out where everyone's, but that one passage in 2 Corinthians, right. They're there. It's interesting, even myself, when I was in Portugal last month, just as I was doing my own daily devotions, I knew that we were going to start teaching on this. So I'm like, I'm going to start reading through 2 Corinthians daily. And I'm like, man, there is so much good stuff here. There's so much stuff that should be. It's like, why isn't this hitting more? As the cool kid said, there's a lot of bangers here. That's what you call the cool songs. There's bangers.
I'm on that one. Yeah, I'm going to go.
It's what the cool kids say.
Yeah.
Let's review what's happening there.
Yeah. Again, we have to be a little bit cautious in terms of, it's quite possible that 2 Corinthians is actually more than one letter stitched together. And I know conservatives are like, what do you mean? It's like, that's not a problem, folks. If they're written by Paul and they attach part of one letter to part of another letter, it's okay. But we might have a stitch job. And if that's the case, to say 2 Corinthians is about this, which part of 2 Corinthians? But generally speaking, especially the last 4 chapters, we say 2 Corinthians is the most autobiographical letter of Paul. The reason why it's so autobiographical is because Paul's defending himself. And he's defending himself because they didn't think he's an illegitimate apostle. So here we elevate Paul to the head of the New Testament, right? We spend more time in most churches in Romans through Timothy and Philemon. 1 Peter is a gem, and most Christians are not even aware of 1 Peter because we spend most of our time in Paul. Yet the people to whom Paul was writing were having trouble with even accepting or rejecting Paul. So Paul was being criticized for a number of reasons. One, as we discussed briefly last week, he chose to work as a leather worker and not as a famous rhetorician. They looked good. They presented themselves well. They made the crowd laugh. That was a big thing, by the way. It's just helping people laugh. And that's how you attracted followers. And Paul's answer is, I'm not going to do that because, as we discussed this in our study of 1 Corinthians, if I do that, I'm watering down the gospel because the gospel is about a crucified Messiah. The second part is that he is working as a leather worker, which is a common laborer. It's a day laborer. It's like saying he's a garbage man. It's like, there's no respect in that. Your pastor's a garbage man? Mine is the revered speaker. So this is a big problem for Paul. So Paul then says that our faith should not rest. Let me go ahead and look it up. So 1 Corinthians, Paul says, and I'm looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. My message and my preaching were not in persuasive words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith would not rest on the wisdom of men, but on the power of God.
Hey, I got a question. Because one of the emphasis that we're going to have here, we're not going to go through verse by verse, but we're going to talk about themes. We're going to look at leadership, church structure, essence.
The nature of the church and what it looks like in the church today.
We're going to do that in every podcast we do in every book of the Bible because it relates to the church. But question about that. Is it wrong for a pastor to make a joke or be personable during a sermon or his encounter on a Sunday? Or does it need, is what Paul's saying here is that you just need to be as reverent as possible, nothing fun, nothing entertaining. We shouldn't do things in an overly polished way. It just needs to be, I'm thinking, a very puritanical way of thinking. Yeah. Is that what Paul is communicating here?
I guess I could see how someone would take it that way. I think we got to be careful about making these absolute conclusions based on what Paul says here, and therefore this becomes the norm by which everyone else must follow. I don't think I would go that far. The way I would apply this to today would be to say, yeah, dressing things up to make it look good. Maybe I'll say it this way. I guess the bigger problem would be when you don't, at the end of the day, elaborate on what the gospel really is. If you're only concerned about dressing it up, making it look good, attractional model, having great music, a great stage, great sound, great speech, and you're all prepared, waxing eloquently. But at the end of the day, you left out, deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me. You left out the cross. You left out sacrificial living. You left out give to the poor. If you leave all that out, that's a bigger problem. So I don't think it's a problem per se. For Paul, it's like, I'm not doing this. I think Paul had other issues. Remember, Paul was not going to take pay because in that culture, he would be under their obligation, now the debt, obligation, debt. Paul's, I'm not doing that. So that doesn't exist as much today. It still does, by the way, right?
Yeah.
It exists in our churches today. So that wasn't as big a problem. So I don't have a problem with saying, when I'm presenting, I want to be prepared and eloquent and not stumble over myself. Because we both know that actually facilitates learning. It facilitates understanding. When you're bumbling all the time or saying, when we're doing those things, it's distracting to the average person. So there's something to be said for making sure that we're teaching in a way that people can hear better. Paul's answer is, I'm just not going to look like these people out there with, we can go a lot of different ways, but as soon as I go a direction, I think people are going to take that as an absolute there. Let's make sure that we're not compromising what the gospel really is. I think that's a more important message for Paul.
Because you could also probably have pastors and preachers who are very pious. They are sincere and reverent. And maybe they're overly focusing on that aspect of thing.
Yeah.
And once again, if they're not including love of God and neighbor, if they're not including the heart of what a gospel message means, they could be as reverent and serious as possible and still be missing the mark as well. If it's just an intellectual exercise, how many times have you heard a sermon and, man, this is a deep dive in terms of they spider webbed the heck out of all these Bible verses. They went really deep in background and they still didn't present a gospel message. They still didn't present the heart of the message. They're entertaining in a way where how often do you see a congregation that loves how deep we preach the message? And it's like, oh, you just made it an academic exercise. The gospel wasn't there.
Again, yeah. And what you're looking at is the pride behind it all.
The hubris
when somebody else walks in that doesn't have a Christian background at all, and you're speaking right over their heads, they're lost. What good is that doing? Or if someone is such a really good, and there's people that are really good speakers and they're really, really charismatic. People are going to listen to you because you're charismatic. Maybe you're good looking, you're charismatic, you carry your voice well, but are they paying attention to your words? And the danger with that becomes, I get this feedback of how much they liked what I said, but the reality is that what I said was empty or what I said was missing or vacuous. So it has to be both. Because I've heard people that are so pious that for me, I just look at it as pretentious.
Exactly.
I don't want to condemn them. I'm just simply saying, for me, and maybe it's me, I struggle with listening to the people like that. I can't pay attention. I need somebody that's more entertaining in terms of the way they speak, not monotone. And maybe I shouldn't be judging them, but I just look at them as being pretentious. I guess at the end of the day, we're not going to make everybody happy and one style is going to appeal to everybody. I think what's most important is the content of the gospel and the loving of your neighbor, and that we're concerned that the neighbor hears the gospel, not hears me, and doesn't feel entertained.
Yeah. From an advisory standpoint, one of my jobs in my previous job was I would train teachers. And so one thing that encouragement that I would always give is, as a teacher, and this doesn't matter if you're leading a small group or teaching a class or having a preaching opportunity, you also want to be true to your personality. And so there's nothing weirder or cringier than when you got person who is more of, they're just naturally going to be a straight-laced person and they think they have to entertain. So they're trying to sprinkle jokes all throughout. And it just gets weird because you're not the jokey kind of person. If you tend to be a more serious, thoughtful person, and that's you, teach that way. And we always want to grow and stretch ourselves in terms of how we pace, how we communicate. And so maybe you need to stretch yourself so you're not monotone and whatever, but don't try to be like something you're not. Likewise, like I struggle with as an ADD kind of person, and you're the same way. We like to be funny. We're energetic. We have all these thoughts coming along. I need to scale back on how much I joke around
Sure.
because that's part of my normal personality. And so I'm not going to avoid ever telling a joke because that's just me. Like it's part of my teaching style, but I'm also not going to work it in to try to be the funny guy. I don't ever program a joke in how I teach. It's stuff that pops up.
Yeah. I try not to tell a joke. Boy, if I told a joke in 7 years of preaching, it might have been a random one or two here and there that had some measure of relevance to the sermon itself. But otherwise, they're spontaneous.
Yeah. So there's a level of authenticity needs to be there. Like you don't want to have your teaching face on.
And don't be somebody else.
Exactly.
It's okay to imitate somebody else because I think we can learn from other teachers. But when we learn from other teachers so much, we're like, I want to be like that person there. That all of a sudden, it's called the stage persona. That's not you up there. That's a stage person up there. And I think that does detract from the message very well.
And all of us do that at a point when we're all learning anything. Think about you played Little League. I played Little League. What do you do at you're 12 years old and you're getting up to hit? And who's your favorite baseball player? I'm going to stand the way they stand. We always do that sort of thing where we try to teach like someone else. We try to do something. As a drummer, I wanted to try to drum like this guy or this guy. And there's something where you're gleaning from other people, but God made you and gave you a voice. Be you.
Yeah.
And teach like you.
Absolutely.
So anyway, that's a side on how we think about these things. And remember, Paul is writing a situational letter. He's also probably trying to correct something specific. He's not laying out his philosophy of teaching. Hey everyone, we want to thank you for joining us on today's podcast. And we want to remind you that everything we provide at Determined Truth is free of charge. And this even includes all of the teaching that Rob does on a weekly basis to pastors in India and around the world. We don't have any supporters that get special behind the scenes access. But we can only do this with the generous support that comes from those of you who can afford to give. So if you would prayerfully consider supporting us with anything from $5 a month or more, we will continue to work hard to challenge the church to be the church. To give, go to determinetruth.com and click on the Give tab or follow the link in the show notes. All right, Paul is having to defend his apostolic authority and who he is. One of the things that the Corinthians are doing is they're complaining about just his trustworthiness in general, and they're hearing negative things from other leaders and that sort of thing, right?
Yeah, so this actually is an interesting conversation if we wanted to get too far afield on psychology and things like that, right? Where people get influenced by a crowd and think, okay, we don't like Paul. And it's the wealthy people, especially who, the lower class people don't mind the fact that Paul is working as a leather worker. Hey, he's one of us. But the aristocrats and others, there might have been a measure of we're not proud of our leader. We want to have a better leader. But it's the wealthy individuals thinking, hey, you're making us look bad and shameful, and we lose our prestige in the society, which was essential to who we are, our status was. So all of a sudden now we have to have reasons why we reject Paul. And well, we reject him because, he's not a man of his word. And so what had happened was Paul had these conflicts there, and he's trying to make the decisions of what do I do here? I'll write them a letter, see what happens there. I think I should go visit in person. No, don't go visit in person. Yeah, go visit in person. So he makes his plans to go visit them in person, and then the plans had to change, and things came up. And so now he didn't come when he said he was going to come. He didn't send them a text message to say, hey guys, I can't make it. I'll be there tomorrow. And so all of a sudden now these accusations come about that he's not a man of his word. He's not trustworthy. He's not reliable. These things just take force. In a normal conversation, if you and I had something going on and you didn't show up or whatever, my first thought would be, okay, something bad happened to Vinnie. Yeah, because I'm going to give you grace because we trust each other. We respect each other. Hey, I wonder what's going on. Maybe I should stop and pray and make sure everything's okay. Maybe I'll send you a text. Hey, is everything okay? And then you might say, yeah, I just forgot, or I overslept, or, oh, no problem. No. And you give grace. But when you want to have reasons to accuse the other individual, then all of a sudden now, oh, he's not trustworthy. He didn't show up that one day that he said he was going to show up. There's no grace given. And that's what happened. So Paul refers to the fact that he made a painful visit to them in chapter 2 of 2 Corinthians. Verse 1, I determined for my own sake that I would not come to you again in sorrow. So hey, I made a painful visit. I decided, you know what, I'm not going to come again because that's not a good thing. And they were using that against Paul, saying that he wasn't a man of his word.
Okay. So they want some letters of recommendation or in that kind of way. It's like, hey, we need other people to vouch for you here.
Exactly. And this becomes this, hey, what are your credentials, so to speak? And Paul's answer is 2 Corinthians chapter 3 now. He says, verse 1, are we beginning to commend ourselves again? Or do we need as some letters of commendation to you or from you? Paul's answer is, you are our letter, written in our hearts, known and read by all men. being manifested, that you are a letter of Christ. I think this is really interesting because it's one of those questions like, how do churches measure success? I'm not sure if we discussed this in the past or not.
Talked a little bit about it last week in the intro.
And the answer is we measure success by attendance or by the number of baptisms. And Paul's answer is the way I discern, or we should discern the success of the church is by the spiritual development of the individuals that are there. Have you grown in Christ? Has my pastoring of you led you to a deeper relationship with Christ? Not just a deeper knowledge, but in a deeper understanding. If you're listening to the podcast, I would hope that's happening. But a deeper commitment, a deeper relationship with Christ. That's the test. Not how many podcasts did we put out, not how many listeners do we have, not how much money have we raised, not how many events do we do, but the spiritual development of the followers of Christ. And I think that's the answer. And that's what Paul gets into in 2 Corinthians 3, where he talks about the Spirit being written on their hearts, which we won't get into it now, but that's exactly what Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36 are about. And for those of you who are listening, Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36 describe the day when God restores his people and he sends his Spirit. And Paul's answer is, you are our letter and our commendation with the Spirit written, not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God. That's almost a direct quote from Ezekiel chapter 36.
As you were explaining the background of the people being frustrated, maybe embarrassed that Paul was a tanner, a leather worker, it's interesting because last week we talked about how pastors oftentimes will measure success and will boast in church numbers, or we have 4 services now, or most of our listeners are going to be church members and congregants. So what are the ways that congregants oftentimes boast in the same way that the Corinthians were? Because I'm thinking I've been guilty of this. Oh, I go to this church and guess what? My pastor, he's on the radio, or he has his PhD, or he also taught here. And what is the first thing that we do when we brag about our churches as congregants is we oftentimes are talking about the accolades and the accomplishments, the resume of the pastor. Oh, he wrote a book. He did this. Congregants can oftentimes do this, and we do the same thing. And I want to go to this church because this pastor has done this or this, whatever. And we're not looking at those other metrics of what is a good, healthy, loving church, though.
Exactly. Yeah. Our metrics for this, and this can go both ways here. So let's talk out of both sides of our mouth for a second.
Yeah.
The first is the fact that we go to churches because they entertain us, because they have things for our kids, which I think I understand that. I'm not going to critique that too much, but for our youth, and especially if you're like a single parent and you want to have a place where ideally there's a good youth pastor or a good youth leader, he or she is mentoring your son or daughter. We get it. No questions asked. You need to go to that church for the sake of your family because your child is in a broken home or your child lost a family member. There's some kind of grief and there's someone there that can spiritually nurture your child. Fantastic. Go to that church. But when we say we go to our church because it does this, because it does that, and we're not measuring it by faithfulness to the word of God, by faith, by transformed lives, by, we did all these outreaches. That's great. But one of the issues that we'll be discussing over time is, are we just feeding the poor? Because that's good. Or are we transforming society and culture so that the poor are no longer poor? There's a big difference between those two. One of them, which they're both good, but unless we address the second one, transforming society and culture where the poor are no longer poor, we're only putting a plug in the dike that's about to break. That's not going to do any good. You fed that person for a day, but you didn't feed that person for a lifetime. At the same time, however, there's this role where it's important to say, so-and-so right now has these credentials and therefore is a voice that we should consider. Now, I think that's important. I think that's essential. When we have a guest on our live streams or on our podcast, we read their credentials, read their bio, because we want the listeners to know, hey, this person has something to say. This person has experience. Now, that doesn't mean that we therefore agree with everything that person says, but it means this person has some credibility, has a right to be an authority on this issue. How's that?
Yeah. And they're not bad. Both you and I have resumes and bios, even on the Determinetruth website, or if we go to speak somewhere. Part of that's just helpful. It's to get people to get to know us. And it is helpful to know the perspective of where someone's coming. So it's not bad in and of itself.
No. In fact, it's probably necessary at times.
Yes. Yeah. The idea of boasting, that's a biblical concept, and we shouldn't be people who boast. What do we say when someone is boasting and maybe someone critique that boasting's always wrong?
Yeah.
I remember I'm a drummer, and the goat of drumming is Buddy Rich. Everyone's like, he's the best drummer of all time.
That's the name I was going to throw out.
Buddy, as a
Buddy,
music
I go with
aficionado that you are, Rob, and as
Buddy,
cultured as you are.
I was thinking of Buddy, and I was thinking of that other guy.
That other guy?
Yeah, that other guy, Johnny, or something like that. Yeah.
John Bonham. See, I'm saving you right
Yeah.
now. Buddy Rich, he was a character, and one time he was asked in an interview about when people say that you're the greatest of all time, and he's like, yeah, I probably am, or I'm really good. And he's like, it's not boasting.
I know how
if
he
this
feels.
and he was like, said something to the effect of, it's just a true statement. I'm not boasting. I'm just saying a fact, which is, you hear that, and it's like you hear a Muhammad Ali or when Ricky Henderson, when he stole bag 939, Lou Brock was the greatest, but today I'm the greatest of all time.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, Rick.
Is that arrogant? Is that boasting, or is that stating a fact? What do we do with that? The concept of boasting, is it wrong? What do we do with that? Is there nuance there?
There has to be. First off, will be the occasion. There's no need to get up for Ricky Henderson to say, I am the greatest. Now, at the same time, someone like Muhammad Ali, I think with sports, you have to be careful, because there's a sense in which the reason why they are the greatest is because they have that mindset. That mindset makes them a step better than everybody else.
Yeah,
So
there has to be a level of arrogance there.
We have to be careful about critiquing it, although I would say, okay, Ricky, after stealing that base, that wasn't the moment. That was just arrogance coming through. But at the same time, we recognize that arrogance is what actually made him so great. But at the same time, now, I think this becomes a problem for a lot of Christians, because we think, oh, humility is this biblical virtue. Remember, by the way, in the ancient world, humility was not a virtue.
Correct.
And so when it's listed in the New Testament, all of a sudden it becomes this great virtue. But we take it to the point where I'm in a job interview and I don't want to brag about myself. And the answer is no. Actually, I would say it this way: biblical boasting is boasting in what God is doing in order to bring glory to Him. So when a person gives their credentials before a sermon, or he's introduced or she's introduced, it's so that you'll listen to them so that they can bring glory to God in their presentation in their sermon. Boasting on a job application or in an interview is not bad or wrong. In fact, it's important, because they need to know your qualifications and why they should hire you. Mm-hmm. And if you don't boast, somebody else is going to boast, and it's going to sound like they're a better candidate than you are. The answer is no, I'm a good candidate for this job. I'll do this company well, and I'll be an asset for the company. That's not boasting. That's expected. And that's actually important, so that the interviewer, the employer, can know whether or not this person is actually qualified. But at the same time, in our American culture, there's a sense where humility is this virtue. So we have to learn how to do that and look humble at the same time. And it's difficult.
Yeah. One of the first times, I'm even thinking about this from a credential standpoint, when you get to be around people with doctorates.
Oh, they're so arrogant. I can't stand it.
Yeah.
Gosh, they annoy the snot out of me.
If you're telling me.
Right? Yeah,
the guy in the room who doesn't have one. But
haven't met a good one yet.
Yeah, exactly. So there's always that idea, like a doctor's only a medical doctor, or like you're not a doctor, you're a dentist, or you're a whatever. And as someone who's gone through grad school, just at the master's level, I realized, dude, that was really hard. If anyone earns a doctorate in anything, hey, if you want to be called doctor, I'll call you doctor, because that was a lot of work. However, it's interesting, as I've just gone on in life, I'm thinking back to my seminary experience. If you earn a doctorate, I'm going to call you doctor because you earned that, unless you tell me otherwise. And so I remember every class I started, probably with the exception of you, because I knew you already, but I would always refer to the person as Dr. So-and-so. And in my seminary experience, every professor I had said, just call me whatever. If you would like to call me doctor.
Okay.
I'm going to, Every person I had at Fuller said, just call me. If you want to call me doctor, if that makes you more comfortable, that's fine. But you could just call me whatever. And I think there's some people who maybe they're generationally, or there's some people who would be preferred to call that. Maybe in an institutional setting, you want to be called doctor because you want to keep a formal relationship. I can understand that. And so there's definitely people inside the theological and church world that are arrogant about that sort of thing. I've met those people as well.
I have to.
But the funny thing is, when you meet people, especially like in the educational world, who they've earned maybe a doctorate in education, and they want to be called Dr. So-and-so, not because it's relevant to anything. They're just dealing with a parent at this point, or they're dealing with peers. And it's like, dude, you're just lording this over right now because you think this and $5 get you a coffee. It's like, who cares? And this really is boasting right now. This is about arrogance. This is about you trying to put yourself on a status and you trying to lord it over us. And that's something I very much appreciated in my seminary experience. This is someone like, we've had Scott McKnight on. He doesn't want to be called doctor. And this is a guy who's like on the Mount Rushmore of evangelical scholarship right now. It's like, dude, if anyone is allowed to be called doctor, it's you, and you just want to be Scott. So I don't, as someone who is a doctor, I don't know if you have thoughts on that way of another way, like in our modern times.
Two things about that. Number one is, we're having a conversation as two white men, because the conversation does change. And the reason why it changes is because when you go to the inner city and minority communities, to be a doctor means they achieved something. They overcame something. And it gives hope to everybody else that you too can overcome this. And look where I came from here and I got to here. So in that sense there, that pride is actually a good thing, and it's a communal thing. And the community actually embraces calling you Dr. King. Martin Luther King was Dr. King. He is Dr. King. We call him Martin Luther King Jr., but he is Dr. King to everybody else, because that's important for that community to say somebody within our community has achieved something. Now, here's the other thing. So I start my semester off at the university and I'm like, hey, you can call me Rob, you can call me professor, whatever makes you happy. And there are some students that my family has raised me that I say, sir, I call you professor, whatever. But I had a student who was clearly calling me Rob, because he was taking advantage of the fact that I said, you can call me Rob. Hey, Rob. There's a sense where there's a disrespect there.
Sure. But even there, you had every right as the professor to correct that. And I, knowing you, though, you're not going to shame the person and make that the thing in order to knowing you. It would be in a way to try to help the other person to say, hey, how are you viewing one another? Yeah. You're not going to make it about you.
You need to have respect for others. And I sense there's a sense of disrespect. But I wouldn't do that in the classroom, especially because I already set the rule saying you can call me Rob. He's just doing what I said. So I think we got to be careful though. But now here's the other thing. So I'm having a discussion on the end times with somebody at the church or whatever it might be. And they're coming from a deeply entrenched, literalistic, radical, dispensational hermeneutic, which means that they interpret the Bible literally at all times. And I'm showing them how it's Christ-centered and it's about the church being the fulfillment of Christ and carrying out the mission of Christ. And someone will go, yeah, Rob's got this authority, he's got a PhD and everything else. And the other person now is stuck. Okay, what do? I can't match the level of knowledge. I can't match the level of academics here. You don't have to have all that knowledge to know the word. They find that this excuse, this actually just happened to me just recently. You don't have to be a scholar to know the scriptures. And this is, that's true. You don't have to be a scholar to know the scriptures, but that doesn't mean that you're therefore right and then I'm therefore wrong. So it was just an interesting experience. Yeah, I liked a lot of what Rob had to say, but you don't have to be a scholar to know the scriptures. I'm like, oh, wow. There's nothing you can say to that, by the way.
It's always an ironic statement, because I've heard it a number of times, because just like, all I need is the Bible and you could be a layperson to understand it. Yet you needed scholars to translate it for you in English. You need this by default. You need the scholars.
Yeah, I don't need scholars to read the Bible. So if that's the case, you needed scholars to compile the manuscripts into the Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic text. So without scholars, you couldn't even have a Greek, Hebrew, or Aramaic Bible. And then you need scholars to translate that in English because you probably don't know Greek. I hope they are. Yeah. I'm really proud of what we've done. I think we've done a great job, and this might be the finest podcast ever.
Rob, there's a lot of podcasts in the world. This is one of them. We hope you're enjoying the podcast, and we want to remind you that everything we do at Determinetruth, the podcast, Rob's blog, and our YouTube channel, is available on the Determinetruth app. Directions on how to download the app is available in the show notes and on the determinetruth.com website. Just click on the app tab. So far, we've commented that 2 Corinthians is Paul's most autobiographical work. He's defending himself against claims that he's not an apostle and that he can't be trusted. Anything else that you want to look at before we look at the text?
By the time we get to 2 Corinthians, and again, this could be the third, fourth, or even possibly the fifth correspondence to the church in Corinth, and Paul's visits. He spent a year and a half there previously, and then he apparently has made a painful visit and maybe other visits as well. A lot of interchange with this congregation. And at this point now, we're ready to reconcile. The first 7 chapters are about reconciliation. But there still is, at the end of the letter, this group of people that are not accepting Paul. They have most likely some level of authority. People are listening to them. And Paul seems to be pretty harsh. So 2 Corinthians chapter 11, let me see verse 3. But I'm afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, your minds will be led astray by the simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ. For if one comes to you and preaches another Jesus whom you have not preached, or you receive a different spirit which you have not received, or a different gospel which you have not accepted, you bear this beautifully. And then Paul says, I consider myself not in the least inferior to the most eminent apostles. And I think some translations say these super apostles.
Super apostles.
But even at verse 6, even if I am unskilled in speech, yet I am not so in knowledge. In fact, in every way, we've made this evident to you in all things. And he goes on again to defend himself, which leads us to think that, again, chapters 10 through 13 might be an extra letter, a separate correspondence that may even have been before, because 1 through 7 is about reconciliation, and this is all good. But chapters 10 through 13 are about, these false teachers, you guys are still receiving them. You're still accepting them. They're super apostles. They come to have these visions. And Paul's like really harsh with them.
So it's important to note, though, Paul's not defending himself just for the sake of himself, which is oftentimes what we do. We're defending ourselves to save face, to make something of ourselves. Paul's defending himself and what he's doing for their sake.
Yeah, it's for their sake because he believes strongly that the message that they are believing over here is detrimental, and that the message that he's proclaiming is actually in the best interest of everyone. And that's really significant. If I can make that analogy with these end times conversations, I think these end times conversations, as you and I have discussed plenty of times now, the popular dispensationalism stuff is dangerous. Whether it's advocating for war in Gaza right now, or whether it's advocating for God's wrath to punish all you people and condemning homosexuals and condemning it. The attitudes that come about from that kind of theology and ideology are dangerous. And so I think that's what Paul's doing. So 2 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul begins by saying, I'm looking at 2 Corinthians 1, verse 3, blessed be the God and Father of the Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies, the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we can comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort which we ourselves are comforted by God. And he goes on to describe the hope that's in Christ. The sufferings of Christ are ours in abundance. This is all great. We had the sentence of death among us, but we were delivered from the peril of death. And he will deliver you also. We've set our hope, and he will also deliver us. It's this message of great encouragement to say, look, I know we've suffered, and I know tribulation and suffering is the lot of the Christian life, and the sentence of death is upon you, but we're doing these things for you. I'm not doing all these great things to get all's attention for my own sake. I'm doing it because of God's love for you, and that we want you to be better off.
And then even in chapter 4, he talks about how he says, my Bible print keeps shrinking. The font keeps shrinking in my Bible.
Blah, blah, blah,
It's
blah,
not my,
blah.
in chapter 4, verse 5, Paul goes on to say, for what we proclaim is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, with ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. And so even the idea there, it's like the ultimate goal is to not glorify themselves, but to glorify Jesus, which is what we talked about in the intro to this.
Exactly. And if we were to get to the heart of 2 Corinthians, the heart of 2 Corinthians is in chapter 5, starting in verse 11. But let me skip down to chapter 5, verse 20, where Paul says, therefore we are ambassadors for Christ, as though God were making an appeal through us. We beg you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. He made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. So this is the heart of the letter. And Paul's interest, our boasting is in you and is for you, so that we can be reconciled to God and you can be reconciled to God as well.
So in a sense, Paul's defense of his ministry, not just a defense of himself, but of his ministry, it becomes a unifying theme of the letter, right?
Yeah. And even if we put the whole thing as one big letter, we could maybe make it work that way by saying that what weaves through all the parts of the letter is the fact that Paul's defending himself as an apostle for the sake of the Corinthians, that they might be reconciled and that they might be reconciled there. Yeah. So one of the things in particular that Paul brings up in this letter then is not just defending himself, but he's defending his suffering. And his answer is that I'm suffering because that's the nature of the gospel, the nature of the kingdom. And I'm an apostle. He's even going to say this later on. I'm an apostle, and you know I'm an apostle because I've suffered like an apostle. And what he's getting at then is that to be a follower of Jesus is to suffer like Jesus did. We've seen this so much throughout the book of Revelation that we spent a couple weeks on. Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 5, he says, our sufferings are ours in abundance. And obviously this goes through the entirety of the New Testament. And we mentioned earlier that passing reference to 1 Peter. 1 Peter is just this gem in the New Testament that talks about the suffering of God's people for the sake of the others. As Jesus was silent before his accusers, so also should we. It's a wonderful message. And I think that's what Paul's talking about is, hey guys, we're called to imitate Jesus by sacrificially loving others, even to the point of death. That's why Jesus said, take up your cross and follow me. And it's this extended theology of suffering of the cross. I think Michael Gorman said it this way. He said, the church is called not merely to believe the gospel, but to become the gospel, and thereby to advance the gospel. The church is a living exegesis of the gospel. And the word exegesis just means interpreting, the living interpretation of the gospel. And then he adds, God's power operates in and through human vulnerability and weakness.
And so the boasting, it's not like the way we would boast. He's not saying, look at the great accomplishments I have in the way that we might do in a resume, just for resume's sake. He's saying, look at all I've endured. And once again, not endured, look at how I've endured and look at how awesome I am for enduring it. Look at all I've endured and for whom I've endured it for.
Yeah, I think you caught onto something that this could be misunderstood, because people can say, oh, I've accomplished all these things and I endured all these. No, enduring is what Paul's talking about, is suffering because of the gospel of Jesus Christ, because we preached the gospel of Jesus Christ, because we lived it out, because we advocated for it. Maybe the easiest way to illustrate that would be, you're advocating for the poor, and that's upsetting the wealthy. And the wealthy thereby come back and bring hardship and difficulty on us. And I think I'm so convinced that the church, the large measure of the American evangelical church especially, that it is the wealthy. It's the very wealthy that are causing, and yet they're defending themselves by saying, oh, look at all the things we've suffered. No, actually, you fed the poor, but you're not willing to change conditions so that the poor are no longer poor. Vinnie, you and I discussed beforehand, and if you listen to this, we did some live streams on abortion the last couple of weeks on the Determinetruth YouTube page. And one of the things about it is that we just simply think, oh, let's just make laws legislating against abortion. Yeah, I'm this good person because I'm advocating for the unborn. And what we discussed in these live streams was, but are you advocating for the women also? Are you sitting alongside the women who are going through difficult times, who are struggling, and maybe they're going to decide to keep the child? Are you willing to help that woman, care for her and nurture her so that she can maybe provide childcare for her, help her get a college education so when the child goes to school at age 5, she can go off and get a better job? Are we willing to do all those things? Or are we willing to say, no, all we want to say is abortion's wrong, abortion's murder? And then the second live stream with Michael Nagasawa, we were discussing the fact that a lot of abortions, and this came up in the first one as well, are the result of poverty. Poverty is one of the leading contributors to abortion. So here goes the question. Are we willing to change the society so that the poor are no longer poor? And I don't think most American Christians are willing to do that. I think we are too comfortable, we're too wealthy, we're too powerful, and we will not give in at all to the liberals. We're not giving it all to the, what did Reagan call the women, the welfare queens. We're not going to give in to the welfare queens. Oh. You know, we have all these reasons why I worked hard, I deserve what I got, I picked myself up on my bootstraps, they can as well. It's like, do you not realize that it was a lot easier for me? I came from a broken family. We had food stamps for a while. My dad never paid child support. My mom was working all the time. I had no parental observation. School was, by the time I got to high school, it was difficult because I didn't know how to take books home because it was easy for me in the early years. And guess what? I got 7 years later, I got a college degree. And guess what? 2 years later, I got a master's degree. And guess what? A few years later, I got a PhD. I did it. You can do it as well. But the reality is, the advantages that I have are not the same advantages that they have. They don't have those advantages. There are kids in inner city schools that don't have textbooks with all the pages in it. That during COVID, they didn't have computers. I know someone was a teacher during COVID and his students were poor farming communities. And he's doing Zoom with his students, high school students, who's babysitting 3 siblings because the parents are working out in the field. That student doesn't have, it's just not as easy. And so I think we have to stop and say, what does suffering for the gospel in the kingdom look like? I don't think it looks like what most American Christians think it looks like. I'm persecuted because they took the 10 commandments out of the schools. No, we're persecuted because I'm advocating for the poor. We're persecuted because I'm advocating against wealth exploiting the poor. We're persecuted because the government's trying to shut us up because we're advocating against war. And we're telling the companies that make these bombs, they should stop making these bombs. And I think that's persecution. And I think that persecution comes from the church more often than not. There, I said it.
In this conversation, it goes back to also the idea of power and who has power and what power looks like. This is First Corinthians talks a lot about this as well. Even if you want to take power into the idea of giftings that he talks about in First Corinthians 12, 13, 14. And even there, like the giftings you use ought to be done with love. And so what is the thing that motivates us in anything we do inside the church or outside the church?
And love is such that it surrenders its own life for the sake of the others. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and laid down his life for her. That's what love looks like. And I think we're just too content with giving that homeless person a sandwich. And we don't even do that very often. And so, no, we need to take care of these things so that they're no longer homeless. Obviously, is a bigger issue because of the mental health that comes along with being homeless. It's a more difficult issue. But are we willing to take care of the poverty issues? We'll discuss this on a live stream coming up as well. But one of the comments that's often made about race and racial issues is the Black families, they just need to get their young men to stay home. And the young men are leaving. And I've done a lot of work with inner city Black pastors. And they say, we're the first ones to admit that we have a problem with our young men staying at home. But at the same time, a lot of their young men are incarcerated. And they're in prison for doing things that white people did, but white people don't go to prison for, or white people didn't get convicted for, or they don't go to prison for as long for. And then they come out and they can't get jobs, they can't get federal housing, they can't get federal support. The system is not set up properly. It's been corrupted. Again, I'm not saying America's back. I think America's been corrupted. That's just the nature of any system. They're all corruptible by human and by power. And I think that's what Jesus was speaking against strongly in the Gospels. And I'm doing that in a series of live streams as well, talking about Jesus and the kingdom. If you go to our YouTube page, you'll find that there also.
Yeah, very good. So even looking at some of the themes of strength, power, even, I guess it would go along with that. But we know the passage in 2 Corinthians 12:10, when I am weak, then I am strong. We look at things like 2 Corinthians 3:18, and we all with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord and being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. And so this is getting into that idea, though, once again, is what does power look like? What does servanthood look like? What is the aim of going to what you said from 2 Corinthians 5, being an ambassador look like?
Exactly. And this is what we discussed in our First Corinthians series, that Paul says the foolishness of God is wiser than men and the weakness of God is stronger than men. That power is shown in the church by submission, by humility, by sacrificial love for the sake of the other, whereas in society, it looks totally different. And they want Paul to look like society. And Paul's answer is, no, I'm not going to do that, because at the end of the day, we will behold the glory of the Lord as we're transformed into the image from glory to glory. So I think that's exactly what this letter is about.
All right, this is good. I think this is a good conversation. I think in previous series, when we've gone through books of the Bible, we've done it thematically, but we've definitely been going through larger chunks of the text and explaining background and that sort of thing. What's really cool, though, is we could almost look back at that as the bedrock of what we're doing here and saying, yeah, we could look at some of the background information, but all that background information we've already gone through, it still applies to something like what we're doing here, the worldview of shame and honor and patron society and all these sorts of things. Apply all that worldview to what's happening here. And I think once we have that foundation of what a first century Gentile Christian church looks like, and then with all the problems, with the obstacles they have, it's like, yeah, that stuff's still happening. So now we could really play out and say, okay, and how does it apply to what we're doing here in the modern day church? Man, there's just so many gold mines for commending and condemning what's even happening in the church and saying, can we critique what we're doing wrong? Can we say, okay, yeah, this is right, but we need more of this? And everything's not a binary. It's not either right or wrong. Right. There's probably just a lot of nuance there and a lot of ways to expand on how we could grow in the church.
Yeah, and let's remind our listeners that we have a week off coming up next week, so there won't be an episode next week.
Yeah.
And then in 2 weeks, we're going to have an interview with James McCarty, who's a professor at Boston University, talking about the business of war. We actually planned on this as part of our Revelation series, but there was some issues that we just couldn't make that work. And we're going to make that a live stream as well, so it'll go on the YouTube channel, and you can watch it. And I think this is one of the key conversations that we have to have for everything that we've been discussing, even on this episode, as well as our study of the book of Revelation, that war is profitable and people are marketing war, even though people are dying because they're making money from it. I think that's where the nation's been corrupted, and we have to look carefully. So I encourage you, that's August 27th will be the live stream, but they'll come on the recording as well.
This is stuff where it's all related to what we're doing in the podcast in a Second Corinthians, because this is a Christian worldview. And the Second Corinthians isn't merely how ought the church service be performed and what should the bulletin look like in the liturgy. It's how do we think about the world and how does that affect the poor? How does that affect the rich? It's power conversations. All these things are interwoven as well. Cool. All right, man. We will see everyone in a couple weeks then in real time.
You won't see anybody.
No. Here's the good thing about Google and Big Brother. We have ways of checking things out. Also, one person, because I think it was 2 episodes ago, I said, hey, if you listen to this podcast, leave a review. We had one person who did it. But I know we have more than one listeners. Hey, kudos to you for leaving that review. Why haven't other people done it? So please do that.
Thank you too.
And I'm like, Tony, you're the best. Thanks for leaving that review. That was great.
All
right, everyone.
Thanks, Vinnie.
I hope you guys have a great week. We will catch you next time. I want to thank you for joining us on today's podcast, and we would love for you to share the work of Determined Truth with others. Please follow this podcast and give a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Your review will go a long way towards helping others find this podcast. Then share it with others so that we can get the word of the gospel of the kingdom to more people.